Welcome. So happy to be here with you today on this beautiful spring day. It's perfect for the topic that we're talking about. On behalf of the League of Women Voters of Greenwich, I'd like to welcome you all to this event. This is the latest in our community speaker series, and I think you're in for a treat tonight. So thank you all for coming. For those of you who don't know me, my name is A.A. Simone. I am a board member with the League. I am on the programming committee as well now as the communications committee. So if you don't like what you're hearing, let me know. We've had such a positive response to this invitation to this event, so we're excited to get started tonight, and we hope you enjoy this. It's timely given that this week was Earth Day as well, and we think this is a topical and important conversation and topic for us to discuss. So before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsors. So as you can see by this long and very, very exclusive list, we have a lot of partners here. We are fortunate that we have so many amazing organizations locally here in our backyard who are interested in this topic and the environment, and we are glad that they are co-sponsoring today. So instead of me reading out every single name, I wanted to leave it up there for a while so that you could also recognize them and help them achieve their goals as well as our goals here at the League. So without further ado, I would like to, it gives me great pleasure actually, to introduce our speaker for today. He's a very highly acclaimed and recognized professor. You'll have to forgive me because I'm going to have to read. He has so many accolades that I actually have to read from a piece of paper, which I don't typically do. So, Professor Peter Domenico is the Dean of Science for the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Columbia University. He is the Thomas Alva Edison, Con Edison Professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences, and a member of the Earth Institute faculty. He is a marine geologist at Columbia's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, which is the nation's leading earth science research institute, also in our backyard, which is amazing. With over 100 published research papers, his research uses geochemical analyses of ocean sediments to understand past climate changes, and he's currently interested in how past climate change may have influenced human evolution, culture, and migration. He is the founding director of Columbia's Center for Climate and Life, which represents over 120 life scientists. And the center directs their philanthropic support to inform solutions and to accelerate the urgent research on climate change risks. We're really excited to have Professor Domenico with us today. We're going to hear about his research studies on ocean sediments to understand how and why oceans and climates have changed, and the impact on human evolution and culture. And then we'll discuss a little bit more in our Q&A these impacts on life's essentials like access to food, water, shelter, and energy in our local communities. So the format for tonight is going to be very familiar to you. So we will start with a presentation by Professor Domenico, followed by audience Q&A. And my colleagues from the League will be handing around microphones. There'll be one on each side. If you have a question, raise your hand. Myself and Professor Domenico will direct our microphone holders to you, and you'll be able to ask your question. So with that, I would like to hand the podium and the microphone over to Professor Domenico. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for sharing your evening with me. It's really a joy to be here in Greenwich. I actually grew up in Rye, so not that far away, and I've actually got some dear friends here tonight as well joining me. So it's a real pleasure to be here. I was actually asked some time ago, I actually gave a talk at Rye Osborne, and that's where apparently someone saw me there and suggested I come speak here. And actually, I'm going to give myself a microphone. Check, check, check. Ooh. Okay, is that okay? Is that all right? Yes. You sure? Okay. I've been speaking about climate and climate change for a long time, and I found that it's just so important for me to reach out to groups that I normally don't speak to, sort of outside of academia. And so I'm spending quite a bit of time really trying to have these conversations with people from really both sides of the aisle, and so I really ask you tonight to perhaps listen to what we have to say, but really, if you have some pressing question or if you have a viewpoint that you feel I haven't addressed, no matter which viewpoint that is, please feel free, and you're absolutely invited to bring that up during the question time. So I've called this climate risk and climate action because one of the least effective ways to communicate what we know as climate scientists about what's happening to our planet is to focus on the sort of doom and gloom of the story that so much you see and read about in the news. It's fundamentally important to understand why climate is changing. And so actually this talk is going to be unlike one I think any of you have ever seen, because we're actually going to get into understanding that very question, actually from a quantitative perspective, actually from a way that uses just sort of basic algebra, but it's something that you can do in the back of an envelope or back of a napkin. So if you want to be the hit of a party at your next party, write down the equations, and it's a way for you to address your skeptic brother like I have. And then the most important thing is climate action, which is that there's actually a very good conclusion to the story, which is that there is a change that's afoot in this country and especially globally. It's actually being retarded and it's actually being slowed down in this country. But there's a change afoot that began about 10 years ago. So we're already actually on our way to solutions, on our way to action. It's just not happening fast enough. So this idea that we're locked into a doom and gloom future is really, that is not the option that we have to take. So this is going to be a three-part story, and actually the first part is drawn from a lecture that I'm going to give on Monday to Columbia's first-year undergraduate students. So at Columbia we have something called the core curriculum, which is a course that all freshmen, all undergraduate students are required to take. It includes humanities and art and music, and now it includes science. And one of the reasons I participated in this program, to teach 550 undergraduates on a Monday morning, is because it's a chance for me to explain to them, as I'm going to explain to you, how we know what we know about the climate system changing. And then the next question, part two, is really, so what? Why is climate changing, and what does it mean for us? And then the third part is the most important part, I think, is that what can we do, what are we doing? So the first thing, that the place to start is at the beginning, and this is the instrumental record of temperature change spanning the last 130 or 140 years. And this is based on thermometer records that you see all around the world, and actually thermometers that are floating in the ocean. And these records are cumulatively sort of brought together into a master plot, and this is the summary of our observational evidence of how the planet is changing. What's amazing is that I was born here in 1960, and so all of this warming that's happened has occurred in my lifetime. And so anybody who's under the age of 20 has lived their entire lives on a planet that no other human generation has seen in terms of the temperatures being warmer than recorded history. So the question then becomes, what's causing this? And that really is sort of the underlying question. So I'm going to take us on a bit of a path here and explore this idea of what's causing the temperature change itself. And to begin with this, we have to understand why the Earth's temperature is habitable to begin with. We're this very comfortable distance from the sun. We're sort of in the Goldilocks position in the solar system. If you're one planet too close, it's too warm. If you're one planet too far out, it's too cold. And so what sets the temperature of the Earth is this simple balance, just like a checking account, where the energy that's being supplied to the surface is balanced by the energy coming out of the surface of the Earth back out to space. So it's a simple equation that links the sunlight energy that's coming in from the sun to the radiation of that energy back out to space. If the temperature of the Earth is changing, there's a change in that balance. So, right, an equation, first on the third slide. Just suffer through it with me and we'll do it together. Because if 18-year-old freshmen can do it, you can too. So the idea is that the sunlight reaching the Earth's surface is this thing that we call energy in, and it's just tied to the energy that's coming from the sun, let's call it a constant for now, times the cross-section of a sphere, which is a circle, pi r squared, that's just the area of the surface of the Earth, times the reflectivity of the planet. So if the Earth had no clouds and no ice, it would have no reflectivity or little reflectivity, whereas the more ice and clouds you have, the more reflective it is, and therefore the less radiation goes into the Earth's surface. So you can just solve this equation. These are all known things, and you can solve them. And it turns out that that number, that's a very knowable number. And then what we need to know is what the Earth light will be. The Earth light going back out to space that's balancing the energy that's being delivered to the Earth's surface. So then we say, okay, well, we know how to do that. It's actually something that's very well known. It's called a black body problem. And it basically says that the temperature of a black body, just let's say, like a red hot poker, for example. If you see a red hot poker, you know not to touch it. Why? Because it's glowing red. Why? Because it's hot. If it's glowing white hot, you really don't touch it. But it cannot be glowing at all, and you can still burn yourself. It's just not that hot, red hot poker. Well, this is true for planets, this is true for suns, this is true for houses. If any of you have done an image of heat leaking from your house, we do this. And basically we can solve this to understand the temperature of the emitting body, whether it's a sun or a planet or a house. And it's just this thing called the Stefan-Boltzmann equation, which is some constant times the temperature of that object to the fourth power. And that's the radiation that's going out of that body. So now we have energy in equals energy out. We solve a simple equation. And it's just this, the radiation that's coming out the surface of the Earth, which is 4 pi r squared, remember that's the surface of the sphere, times the energy that's going off the surface per unit area. Okay, we're almost through. So this mess here, all we're going to do is, you remember from just high school algebra, all you have to do is solve for this T thing here. All you do is kind of move stuff over and solve for T, and you get this equation. This is a really simple equation, very easy to solve. You can do it on the back of a napkin, but it's incredibly powerful because right off the bat, you can calculate what the temperature of the Earth should be if it had no atmosphere. It's just this rock out in space. We're not just a rock, we've got an atmosphere, but it's just that. It turns out the Earth temperature should be below freezing. We should be a ball of ice, and we're not. It should be minus 18 degrees, but we know the observed temperature of the Earth is about 30 degrees warmer than that. Now, before I even go a step further, why is that? Why is the Earth warmer than what we expect it to be if it had no atmosphere? Because it has an atmosphere, right? So we're going to give it an atmosphere. So just like you have a greenhouse, we're just going to stick in a glass, a pane of glass in the atmosphere. Just call it an atmosphere. And that glass is basically going to be transparent to visible light, just like a greenhouse is, but it's going to be opaque to outgoing infrared radiation, which is how a greenhouse works. And so the energy that's coming off the surface of the Earth that goes through the atmosphere, interacts with the mass of the atmosphere, and then it radiates up and down. And so some of the energy goes out to space, but some of it gets reflected back down, and this is the greenhouse effect. So now it turns out, if you just figure out the math of this, it turns out that this new ground temperature with just one pane of glass is now 20% warmer than it was without an atmosphere. It's basically like a blanket. So adding this layer traps the heat really well. How does this have any relevance to the global warming problem? It turns out that the pane of glass is indeed the greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere. What happens is outgoing radiation from the Earth's surface interacts with these triatomic molecules like water and CO2. In this case, it's a linear CO2 molecule. It actually vibrates it, just like a singer can shatter a wine glass. Infrared radiation is tuned to vibrate this molecule in this very specific way. There's another vibration mode where it goes like that. There's another one where it goes like that. There's another one where it rotates. And they're all different frequency bands. It turns out that if you are like a satellite looking down at the Earth and saying, what kind of light is coming from the Earth's surface? It's actually infrared, so we can't see it with our eyes. If we were snakes, we could, but it's infrared radiation coming from the Earth. It turns out that right in the center of where the Earth is radiating energy back out to space, remember energy in equals energy out, there's this CO2 molecule absorption. So the Earth is actually opaque, partially opaque to outgoing long-wave radiation that would otherwise cool the planet off. So this is why we have the greenhouse effect. This is why adding more CO2 warms up the atmosphere. So if you could look at the Earth from space, this is in the visible range, But if we actually put on our infrared goggles, it would look like this. It looks very different. The reason why is because the atmosphere is literally just glowing. It's this warm, glowing plasma, if you will, of energy that's taking the heating from the surface, distributing it with air currents and ocean currents around the planet, and then it's radiating out like a roasting chicken on a rotisserie, just like that. So, this equation again, I thought you said it was, we're going to see it again. It turns out you can say, well, how many of you have heard this idea that, well, global warming is happening because there's more solar activity? That's a story that we've heard. Well, we can ask the question of this thing now. We can actually ask that as a quantitative question on your cocktail napkin. We can also say, no, it's going to be changes in clouds. That's what's causing climate change. We can ask that question too. So it turns out the sun is a star, and it has an 11-year solar cycle that goes up and down. The total cycles are only about 0.1%. It only varies by up and down by about 0.1% due to sunspot cycles. So some of you may have heard this idea that, oh, it's the sun, and this is the observed warming here that we see over the last 140 years. We've actually been measuring solar irradiance for 4 of these cycles, and we can reconstruct it going back. There is no trend to the solar forcing. So the warming that you're seeing is going up and up and up. Solar cycle, solar radiation is just going up and down and up and down. So that's how you answer that question. So if somebody says it's the sun, you can say, pull out your napkin, write out down the equations, say the sun's just going up and down, it can't be that. One thing that actually turns out to be very important is volcanoes. When you have big volcanic eruptions, it actually makes the Earth brighter, and so it actually blocks out the sun. That's why you get crazy sunsets during big volcano years. So some of you may have seen Edvard Munch's painting of these brilliant colors of the atmosphere. He was painting that at the same time there was a big volcanic eruption. So those skies are really true, same for Turner. So when you ever have these big volcanic eruptions, these cool the planet, but they only do so for a couple of years and then it goes back to its original temperature. So putting this all together, so if any of you are interested in this, there's a wonderful graphic that was put together by a colleague of mine that was run on Bloomberg, where we look at this, we look at all these individual impacts. So this is the observed temperature that's observed, on thermometers all the way around. Thermometers are neither Republican nor Democrat. They're just recording the values they are, and there is really no debate among either side about whether this black curve is true. We're all on board. I can talk to that point if any of you are interested, but this is an accepted observation amongst all of us. So then the question is, what's causing that warming? And so you can break it down. Is it variations in the Earth's orbit, as Inhofe said, as Senator Inhofe said? No, it's not. That's too slow. Is it variations in solar activity like we just looked at? No, that's too small. Is it volcanic eruptions? Well, you can see some places where we do get cooling that match the record as well. So volcanic eruptions do matter. You can add all those natural effects together, but they don't capture the trend. They don't capture the recent warming. Then you can say, well, maybe it's changes in land use. We're cutting down the Amazon. Or perhaps we're looking at changes in ozone, the stratospheric ozone. That's not causing it. Stratospheric aerosols coming from burning coal actually cools the planet a little bit. And then if you look at greenhouse gases alone, they warm the planet too much. So then you can add in all the man-made stuff together, add all those curves that I've looked at, you add all those things together, compress them, and you get a pretty good fit. But the amazing thing comes in when you add the natural and the man-made stuff together, and that's the red guy. And you get a perfect fit. So this is why people like me are so confident that there's a human fingerprint on modern global warming. In fact, it's 100% of the observed warming today is due to us. Yes, there's year-to-year variability, it can be due to El Nino, it can be due to whatever, but the overall trend is 100% us. In fact, it's a little more than 100% us because we should be entering an ice age. So a common retort one gets is that, oh, this past winter it was so warm, or we had snow in the summer, or whatever that is. Indeed, you may have had all those things. You may have a snowball on the Senate floor. You may have You can have all sorts of strange weather events happen, but it's just weather. Weather is what you get, and climate is what you expect. And what's happening is climate is changing, what we expect is changing. But if we look at this animation, red is warmer than average, blue is colder than average. As we go through the 1920s and 1930s, you can see it's mostly blue and splotches of red. But then as we get in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, you can see the planet heating up. And so these are what we call temperature anomalies, the departures from average that are actual real observations. Again, these are thermometers. You can focus on satellite data if you want, but regardless, the Earth is unquestionably warming. So now we get to go to the second part. No more equations. We're done. The first part's over. I promise I'll take off my jacket. I'll end the professorial thing. Yeah, so why does it matter? So the Earth is alive, and the Earth is breathing. The oceans have variations in productivity, which is the green. Land has vegetation growing and moving away, and this is all varying seasonally. So the planet is literally alive with life, and that is breathing oxygen and carbon into the system. So as climate changes, we can expect the life-supporting systems of the planet to change as well. And so the reason why we care about climate is not only because the mean average temperature is warming, but really honestly, that's not what keeps me up at night. What keeps me up at night is that climate impacts life's essentials. So when we look at things that we really care about, like food, water, shelter, energy, health, or the impact of those things on our retirement savings, or the impact on those things on our house value, or the impact on those things on our children. These are things that actually speak to us personally, and this is what I focus on. This is where my current interest comes in, because this is something we can inform, where science can be very useful in informing what's going to happen in the time scale of that happening. So, for example, we have some of our scientists at the Center for Climate and Life have been focusing on how crops change. So the 4 main commodity crops have been examined within the perspective of how they're responding to the changes in climate. And what's interesting is that the crop yields are principally not responding to this mean change in temperature. What they're responding to is that as the temperature mean changes, so too do the extremes. And so these very warm extremes that you get as the planet warms start to become warmer and warmer, and so what we call, let's say, a heat wave becomes larger and more frequent. So now imagine that you're a wheat plant or a corn plant. These are things that induce withering and reductions in plant growth during their growth cycle, particularly during flowering. The take-home point is that crop yields for the 4 main commodity crops globally, rice excluded because it's a saturated product, water product, is about 5 to 10% reductions in yield per degree centigrade. So what this introduces is just shocks to commodity prices. And these reverberate throughout the planet. For us, they mean slightly more expensive Wheaties or slightly more expensive bread. But for the rest of the world, which doesn't have the wealth of this country, these price shocks wash up like tidal waves on their economic systems. So one of the other ways in which climate is impacting this country, but in particular the Levant region, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe, is through water availability. Basically, as carbon dioxide rises, this place that just became brown becomes more water stressed, becomes drier. So the fires that you read about, or that you saw last summer, or these extreme drying events you've heard about in Texas and elsewhere, those changes in dryness is actually part of a long multi-decadal trend that has just emerged actually since the turn of this millennium. This is again work that was done at Columbia, but the sort of take-home point here is that water availability is already, but will increasingly become a major risk. Something that actually a study that was done in this neighborhood, but really was, the test case was in Miami and in Long Island, in the Hamptons, was examining flooding risk on home values. And this was actually done by some Columbia Business School professors and some of our climate scientists. that looked at, they did a very fascinating thing. Rather than looking at like zip codes or townships or whole municipalities, what they did, they looked at adjacent homes in high-value neighborhoods. And they said, this is a home that is, let's say it's a $10 million home or a $5 million home in a high-value district, and its immediate neighbor, literally the next door neighbor, has another house that's, let's say, worth the exact same amount, but it's 1 foot lower. And it's subject to nuisance flooding during these super tides. So any of you who've gone out to American Yacht Club during a full moon, you know exactly what it's like, right? You can't go out because your car's flooded. Those nuisance flooding events were things that we all just kind of put up with when I was a teenager, but now they're things that are really affecting your willingness to live in a certain area. So you know that, and potential buyers know that, and so this has now entered the market. And so flooding risk knocks $7 billion off home values, study finds. That's just for one district, that's just for one area. I think this one was for, this was for New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. There's another one that was done for Miami. But this is something that's actually impacting home prices now. And then there's the economic risk, which is, so there was a study that Mike Bloomberg led called Risky Business, which just looked at the United States. And forgive me, but I'm actually going to make this a US-centric talk because we're the only country that doesn't get it. But this is, it's important to know just how much we know and just how much is at stake. So the result of this 160-page study was that climate change and its associated risks on property values, physical damage, infrastructure damage, lost work days, because actually when it gets too hot, people can't work outside. You actually reach what's called the wet bulb temperature, so you actually can't evaporate and die. So this, the climate cost was projected for just the next couple of decades to be something on the order of 1 to 2% of GDP. So GDP is 18 trillion, something like that, in this country. So it's hundreds of billions of dollars. And that seems incredible, right? Like, we're not paying $100 billion a year in additional costs. I'm not paying for that. And you can imagine if I was giving this talk in a redder state, it'd be like, no way are we paying for that. That's not the insurance company. These are all, these would all be considered uninsured risks, supplemental risks. So it turns out that in, let me see if I got this, yeah, I'll show this. So this is the number in this coloring histogram, the number of billion-dollar-plus losses, property losses, loss events associated over the last 40 years roughly. And you can see there's a general upward trend in just the number, which is the colored bit, but then you can see this kind of dash line or this line in here, this faint line. Look at that number here. That was 2017. If you just read the axis, it's too small, so I'll read it for you. $300 billion. It was actually $320 billion of loss in 2017. That is 1/2 of the US military budget. And who's paying for that? We're paying for that. You, me, Democrats, Republicans alike. All Americans are paying for this. Consequently, the National Flood Insurance Program is broke. And we basically have no funded capacity to handle disaster at the moment. So someone's got to pay for this. These are real losses. Houston didn't just get rebuilt out of goodwill, right? Houston was rebuilt out of real dollars coming from us. So these are, this is a real impact on the economy that regardless of how you vote, we're all paying for it. So the third part, again, no equations, concerns solutions. And I'm going to spend some time on this because really this is the place where I have the most optimism. And sometimes when I'm giving this talk, people come up to me afterwards and they say, that was a surprisingly optimistic talk. They thought it was going to be very negative. For sure, I want you to understand that I understand that I'm very concerned about what's happening right now. And I think it's an urgent problem that needs to be dealt with immediately. This is not a hypothetical problem down the line. But we'll look at the different kinds of solutions that are out there. Obviously, this is lumping them together in one way, once we do it in many ways. But I'll start with the political, which is all these happy people in 2015 celebrating the signing of the Paris Accord, which at the time had everyone signing, including the United States, except for a couple of countries. Now those other 2 countries have signed on, and we have dropped out. So in a nutshell, the Paris Agreement was an agreement where there's international independence to determine your contribution, so no one's telling any country what they have to do. But the idea was, or the unifying idea was to limit warming to plus 2 degrees centigrade warming. We'll get to why that is in the next slide. But the notion is that in the climate science community that 2 degrees centigrade is a red line we don't want to exceed. And so the major emitters, and China being the most important, they are the #1 emitter, but that was also a sticking point to any prior deal coming together. This is why Paris was so important. And then also to adapt to a changing world, in particular dealing with the developing world, which will not have the resources to address some of the changes coming down the line. So why 2 degrees centigrade? It seems such an arbitrary number. Why not 2 degrees Fahrenheit? Why not 3? You know, what is the rationale behind 2 degrees centigrade? And this is where scientists like myself and Maureen Ramo, who has spoken to this group I think before, have contributed really the essence of the knowledge that constrains this. So we asked the question of the geologic record, when was the last time the Earth was 2 degrees warmer than today? And it turns out you have to go back pretty far back in the geologic record to get to a time when the Earth was that much warmer. We've had glaciations, like 20,000 years ago, there was a mile of ice over Greenwich. That was during the Ice Age. The Earth was, on average, 5 degrees colder than it is today. That made the last Ice Age. The Ice Age sea levels were 120 meters, so 360 feet lower than where they are today, because all that ice, all that water got stuck up to make ice sheets. So the Earth was on average 5 degrees colder, and it supported these ice sheets that dropped sea level by 320 feet. So we can then ask the record, well, when was the last time the Earth was appreciably warmer than it is today? And it goes back to a time called the Middle Pliocene, which is about 3 million years ago. And it turns out that there is an ancient shoreline that runs up and down the east coast of the United States called the Orangeburg Scarp. And I could show you a photograph of this, but it's kind of like looking at, it's like looking at Nebraska. It's like it's flat, and then there's this little bump. Because the scarp itself, or the ancient shoreline, and that's what this is, it's an ancient shoreline from 3 million years ago. See these green dots? Each one of these is a recorded location of where the ancient shoreline was 3 million years ago. So it turns out that if you go to these sites, you find these things. You find scallop shells, and you can date them. They turn out to be 3 million years old. And you go up and down and find basically where the shoreline was. Well, it turns out that elevation is 75 feet higher than it is today. So the last time temperatures were at 2 degrees centigrade and the Earth came to equilibrium with that temperature, sea level was 75 feet higher than it is today, globally. Not just the east coast of the United States, but globally. And this is because the Earth responds, the ice sheets respond very sensitively to changes in temperature, just like we talked about with the glaciation. Remember, the Earth was 5 degrees colder, and sea levels were 120 meters lower than they are today. These are temperatures that are about 2 degrees higher than today, and sea level is 75 feet higher. And the number that the IPCC is asking you to worry about is 6 feet. Now that's not 6 feet of equilibrium response. That's just where we're going to be at the end of the century. It's going to keep on rising. That's just like the waypoint number to pay attention to. The equilibrium number is a much higher change. So I and many of my colleagues and most of America was pretty disappointed when we so-called pulled out of Paris. But don't be led astray on that political action because we are still in Paris. The only way we can get out of Paris is to leave the United Nations. We're still in because of Article 28 in the Paris Agreement that was signed by the United States. As signatories, we are compelled to stay in that agreement until the day before the next presidential election. Until 2020. So Article 28 basically says we're in it, but still, the president can defund it, the president can remove all funding for scientists to study this, which he's done all those things. So he can de-emphasize it, and that has happened, or the government can de-emphasize it, and that has happened. We have major carbon emitters across all these cities, and all these states are in to this agreement on the Paris Pledge, which is to reduce the United States carbon emissions to 26 to 28% of their peak values from 2004. So what does that look like? Well, this is actually the energy-related carbon dioxide emissions for this country. And again, I apologize for non-Americans in the room. I'm making this a U.S. story just because it's a tidy story. So there were the peak emissions at around 6 billion metric tons, and we've been steadily declining. And this is the target. This is the Paris target, these red dots. This is the Copenhagen Accord, this is the Paris Agreement, and we've been doing great. The United States has been doing great. Other countries are doing even better. The United Kingdom, I don't know how many of you know this story, so the United Kingdom is now, its carbon emissions are lower than they were. Does anyone know the answer to this? When Queen Victoria was reigning. It's just incredible. I mean, so the UK has just really led the way, but Denmark and Sweden and all these other countries are doing even better. This reduction, though, in the United States is doing great. And this was a happy story until this year when in 2008, it's at 3% above, or 3.5% above where it was the year before. We wanted to go down, it's going up. It's going up because we know why. Yeah. But what's interesting is that the reasons for this decline were initially, you guys are great. Why are the emissions going down?
Recession.
Recession is 2008. 2008, right there. Yep. The main reason they're going down is natural gas. So basically the phasing out of coal and shift to natural gas peaker plants. So most of our energy is coming from natural gas, which is a much cleaner fuel, and we've got lots of it. It's also because of efficiency. Things as simple as Energy Star, building codes, those things actually save a lot in the way of emissions. And the third reason is renewables. So 10 years ago, even 10 years ago, renewables contributed next to nothing to our energy portfolio. In this country still, it's almost next to nothing. It's very small compared to most other countries. But what's interesting is that for those of you who've heard this argument, and this is certainly something I heard when I was growing up, is that in order to be a wealthy country, you have to be an emitting country. That is, your wealth, you can show it on the log-log plot, that the poorest countries basically have no carbon emissions, and the wealthiest countries have the highest carbon emissions. And it's many orders of magnitude. It's a log-log plot. So if you're the United States, you're over here, and if you're North Korea, you're down here, and then there's a spectrum in between. And the argument has always been, well, you're going to throw us back to the Stone Age if you're going to cut down on emissions. And that's baloney. It's baloney because just in the last decade or so, we've been doing exactly the opposite, which is that the GDP has been rising, there's your recession, the GDP has been rising, and emissions based on a carbon intensity plot or calculation are declining. How can that be true? The economy should be faltering if we're reducing emissions. It's not true. We're just being smarter with the resources we have. Rather than being profligate with our carbon sources, we're actually being more efficient with them, and we're adopting non-emitting sources of energy, such as solar and wind. Texas leads the country in wind generation. It's a huge part of their portfolio. Solar is taking off in a number of different states, in particular states that have committed to 100% clean energy profile within the next 15 to 20 years. What's happened, what's forcing this is not a government mandate to adopt renewable energy. There's no politician telling me I have to put solar panels on my house. What's happened is that the economy is doing it. That is, the economics of the problem have solved themselves, which is that the cost has been declining. I'll show this in a subsequent slide, but the cost has been declining toward the present. And because things are getting cheaper, the installed capacity is just going through the roof. Same for wind. This is for wind, and this is for solar. It's the same story. There's something that engineers call a learning rate, which is that any technology, you can think of computer chips, you can think of wind turbines or solar panels, that if you make a plot of the cost per unit performance versus the installed capacity or the distribution, so think everyone in this room probably has some smartphone of some sort. If you went back 15 years ago, probably very few of you would have had them. If you consider this relationship, basically things are expensive and not installed, that is not widespread, and then they become cheap and widespread. The slope of that line is what's called the learning curve. And the slope of that line has a learning curve of 19%. And that 19% means that there's a 19% reduction in cost for every increase in the cumulative capacity. So the same thing for solar, it's about a 24 to 28%. Again, it's just the slope, and these are actually hard data. These are actually data that are defined from the market. So this gives us an idea of just how rapidly we can expect this to increase. In fact, I've got solar panels in a backfield of my house, and I installed them 4.5 years ago, and they've paid off. I've gotten all my capital back, and now I'm up a few $1,000s. But the more important thing is that, it was the hardest thing about it was trying to find an electrician who knew anything about installing solar panels, and it was hard. And actually, he made a lot of mistakes. But the technology is a no-brainer. It's a total no-brainer. So then the question becomes, well, how cheap is it going to get? Why don't we see them everywhere? And the reason is that for a while, going back about 10 years or so, very few states had what's called grid parity. That is, the cost of producing a unit of electricity using solar or wind was at or below the cost of conventional fossil fuel power supply at the plug. So if you're getting electrons from a coal plant or from a nuclear plant, whatever you're paying for your electrical bill, solar has to be cheaper than that for it to be readily adopted in the wider market. Everywhere that you see as green or light green has cross-grid parity. So anywhere, with the exception of West Virginia, big coal-producing plants or states that have big investments in nuclear, these are basically, it's all downhill economically. And so it's no longer a luxury to go for wind or solar. It's actually an economic imperative. So as Thomas Edison presciently said, it's unbelievably, I actually had to look this up because I didn't believe it. I thought it was fake news, but it's true. He actually said, I put my money on the sun and solar energy. What a source of power. I hope we don't have to wait until oil and coal run out before we tackle that. I wish I had more years left. And, this is my professorship is named after this guy, and somehow this really stuck with me. It's really true. It's, we are there. We are in the midst of this revolution, and many of us don't even know it. And it's just, it's no longer the right thing. It's no longer the right thing to do. It's a smart thing to do. It's the economically sound thing to do. So this was a little factoid that really took my breath away when I discovered this. But if you ask, so the U.S. is a very electricity-hungry country, as we all know. And then you say, well, aren't we going to have to just pave the United States with solar panels to provide enough electricity for us? about the size of Delaware. To power the whole country is 100 kilometers to a side. And that was actually now going back 8 or 10 years. And already the solar panels I put on my property, I can put in new solar panels that are 40% more efficient per unit area. So I can make 40% more energy at a half or a third the cost. So this is so doable, and we're not doing it. So then the counter to this will often be, well, wait a minute, you can't just be generating wind and solar, it's intermittent power. What happens when you have night, and what happens when the wind dies down? What are we going to do? Da, 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 da. This is the learning rate for solar. Again, it's 24%. This is the learning rate for batteries. Batteries, as far as we can tell, again, it's not that long, but it has the same slope, 20%. So then you can ask the question, how long is it before we can store 24 hours of global energy use? And it's within their lifetime for sure. I'm pointing to 5-year-old kid. But it might even be toward the very end of my lifetime, but it's certainly within the next generation's lifetime that we will be able to store all of the, and then the argument, oh, there's not enough lithium. The new battery technologies are not dependent on lithium. So then you can say, well, it's such a divisive issue, this country will never come together on this. We're wrong on that also. 85% of Americans support funding research on renewable energy. It's a different question than do people want solar panels or wind turbines in their backyard. I appreciate that. But the notion that the United States is divided on this issue is not true. If I'm saying it, they might be divided on that. The politics of whoever is presenting the proposal is one story, but on the basic fact about whether this is something that's worth doing, we agree on that. The last thing is that, or not the last, almost the last thing, is that the renewable sector is a huge source of jobs. There's something in the order of 3.3 million jobs. I just pulled this up yesterday. In 2019, clean energy jobs, the number of clean energy jobs outpaces fossil fuel by 3 to 1 in this country. So if you're thinking about how big the oil exploration industry is, or how big the coal industry is, it's not that big. It's wealthy, it's widespread, it's something we've seen our entire lives. It's not that big. Turns out that people who are working clean energy are big, but they're dispersed, they're sent out all around, they're clustered in California and Massachusetts, and they're not in West Virginia. But the job growth here is 6% per year, and it's outpacing the larger economy by a large measure. So this is a huge job creator as well, and they're high-paying jobs as well. So I'm optimistic on that as well. But by far the biggest thing is the kind of mega trend, or the larger economic trend of a steady divestment out of fossil fuel, regardless of what anyone is saying. Coal is not coming back. Coal is dead. It is not coming back. Coal employs as many people as Arby's. And you wouldn't toss away the planet to save Arby's, right? So the fossil fuel industry here is, the long-term story is in decline. Now, whether there are good years and good quarters and bad quarters to pull out, that's for other people to decide. But the long-term trajectory is not one. It's not a hold. In contrast, the clean energy investments are estimated to be $5 trillion investment over the next decade. You can say, well, where are you getting that number from? Well, just last year alone, it was $300 billion, $330 billion in renewables investments. So, so in terms of what we need to do, the way to really couple this is to bring renewable energy sources with electrifying transport. And that, of course, is another thing that's taking off. Not everyone has an electric vehicle, but they're becoming much more affordable as time progresses. You couple that to solar panels on your house, you'll never pay another electricity bill. So how to reduce emissions? Well, it is this convergence between renewables and electrification, and basically this is our emissions trajectory over the last 150 years. And we need to be down here to 0. And that's the shocker. We don't have to get down to 90% or 80%. We need to have peak emissions in the next years. We don't have a decade. When people say the Earth is ending in a year or 10 years, what they're referring to is we need to reach peak emissions and start our way down. But we can get down to about 60% of current emissions just with these two things alone, and we have the technology already. So then if you just ask yourself, well, how much time do we have? It really is 0. We have no time. We're living on borrowed time. If we had done this 10 or 15 years ago or 20 years ago when we were first talking about it, we'd be in a much better position and the downslope wouldn't be so steep. The longer we wait, the steeper the slope is, the more draconian the changes have to be. And bad decisions happen when you have to do those kinds of things. So this is why I say, how much time do we have? We're sort of living on borrowed time. We need to do it now. There are ways we can pull carbon out of the atmosphere. That's technology is not scaled. Columbia is one of the best places in the world to do this, to study this. It's nowhere near scale, not even close, not even with orders of magnitude. We can turn CO2 to rock. We can do this in the lab. We can't do it at large scale. We've done it out in the field here in Iceland. Our group at Columbia did this with the Icelandic government, but it's not nearly at scale. This is a totally bad idea. Plan B, geoengineering, trying to load up planes with aerosols and spray it around the planet is an absolutely hard idea. So the take home is that staying below 2 degrees centigrade really is to increase efficiency, increase renewables, electrify transport. Negative emissions are in the mix because they have to be. The need for science has never been greater, and the threat to science has never been greater, certainly in my lifetime. I've grown up, I actually was an art major when I started in college, and then an art and math major, and then I fell in love with the Earth, because it's such an interesting, hard problem. But science is very much under threat, and yet we can do so much to help inform our future. And I think this is really the hard part of this, is that we need to really elevate the sciences. So that's what we do here at the Center for Climate and Life, which is to understand how climate impacts life's essentials, as we've been talking about today. So what you can do, and I'll leave it here, is to talk about it. I hope tonight just spurs you on to talk about it again with your friends. Talk to the relative who may not share your opinion. One of the reasons why I'm here tonight is vote. Vote like it matters. Get your friends to vote. Don't tell them how to vote, just get them out there. But vote, act. We should put a price on carbon. That would be the fastest way out there. Lead by example. And most importantly, reach across the aisles. I hope to do tonight. So let's just leave it there, just to realize I'm ending with this, the Earth at night, because I've only been talking about 5% of the world's population in the United States. The rest of the world is going to fare much, much worse than we are. And there's a whole ethical dimension to our decisions in the next year or two that really impacts the rest of the globe. So thank you very much.
Thank you, President Herfeld. We're going to start the Q&A session now. You can see that we have 2 microphones on either side, so if you have a question, please raise your hand, and we'll take the first one next to you, Anne-Marie.
You had pointed out that plants are a very good source to remove carbon from the atmosphere, yet we're hearing every day that the Amazon is getting cut away. I heard today about forests up in Canada being cut down, and of course throughout the U.S. we're seeing that too. How do we get that trend to stop?
Right, so deforestation is responsible for something like, I think it's 15% of the overall emissions, and that's because obviously you cut down things that suck down carbon out of the atmosphere and let them rot, that carbon goes back into the atmosphere. There are a number of ways. Actually, a family friend, Whedon family, some of you may know them, they live here in Greenwich, actually had a debt for nature swap where they were exchanging national debt for preserving parcels of land and valuable biodiversity areas. That's a very small way to do it, but the bigger story is to put value on the land that's being deforested. And I think that's the single biggest thing that's, I think, emblematic of our general relationship with nature, is that we don't value ecosystem services. The reason why we're not paying a price for carbon is that we're not putting a value on that process of putting carbon in the atmosphere. It's free. It's a garbage dump for the whole world. You all get to decide. Thank you for having so many questions.
Hello? Hello, hello?
Check, check, check.
Check, check, check. Okay, is that working?
Project.
Project, okay, I'll just talk loudly. So thank you very much for coming out today. That was an amazing talk and very concrete and easy to understand. So thank you so much for that. One of the things you mentioned was the ice age, and that 3 million years ago it was 2 degrees warmer. And I understand that temperature change back then was happening over a very, very different time frame. But are there any lessons from those changes for today? Is there anything we can learn from the past in that regard?
Yeah, that's a great question. So all of you heard the question, which is how can the past inform the present and the future? That's actually my job, preferred job. I think the best way to answer that is I can tell it through a story. So one of my jobs as Dean of Science is I have to talk to a lot of alumni from Columbia. So I had a meeting in Houston to talk to an oil man who had been very generous to the university and wanted to meet me. And so I met with him, went to his office, and he said, we're both geologists, son. I said, yeah. And then he said, we both know that there are cycles in the climate. And I drill through those all day long, and I see these beds representing climate change. And you can't tell me that today is important, because I can see these climate changes in the rocks that I'm drilling. It's like, you're right, on the latter part. And so then I just asked him, I said, well, how much time do you think is between those two layers that's, let's say, 3 feet apart? He said, 20,000 years. That's one of these orbital cycles, right? I said, yeah. So you can calculate the rate of change of, let's call it a 5-degree temperature change, or 3 degree over that period of time. What we're doing now, remember, all the warming has happened in just like a century. And actually, most of the warming has just happened in the last 30 years, 30 or 40 years. So when you actually calculate that number, you're orders of magnitude faster what's happening now than what has ever happened in the past. And so the past kind of gives you an understanding that how and why climate can change naturally, but those processes are generally slow. And what's happening now is happening in the blink of an eye. I'm not certain I answered your question completely, but that's one way of answering it.
This was a very compelling talk, and when you start thinking about how we could take action, which you've advised us to do, one thing that would be very cool is if everyone in this room could somehow take 10 friends and convey the same content to them. And I know that like Tony Siva out of Stanford did a YouTube video where he walked through, he had his hour-long lecture on YouTube, so you could send it to 10 friends. And do you have something like that that we could pass on to people?
You got me. No, but we've thought about that. That's a very good idea. It needs to be just right? Try to make it factual, non-partisan, all that.
This is pretty good.
Thanks. Well, I can actually condense this. So, if any of you have ideas or capacity, I'm certainly willing to entertain it.
Thank you again for your participation. Can you hear me? I think your idea about cocktail napkins is a bad idea because that means you have to drink a little cocktail and have it ready. So it goes to that question of the data that you showed on the screen. Is that accessible through your website?
It's nationally accessible. As a taxpayer, you have access to all these data. There are national archives everywhere. I can point you to them, but everything that you see here is available.
Because then the other question comes to, if that data could be transferred, and I think the Audubon Society and a number of other related climate organizations are doing, is they're putting data on a very specific, almost zip code, census tract basis, right, to show that, hey, in 20 years, you're going to be 75 feet underwater. Even if you're a Republican, aren't you concerned, kind of, to get that kind of thinking?
Right.
That's the kind of process that I think that you can help initiate and push. You'll get more to the will question about what we need to do.
That's a great question. I mean, my take home from your question was make it local. And that's actually one of the things we're really focusing on, not only in Columbia, but in our research community, which is to get very specific about how it's going to impact individual communities. Because decisions, personal decisions, who you marry, how you live your life, where you choose to live, they're very individual decisions. And what goes into those decisions are sometimes rational, sometimes not, but hopefully the big important ones are very well thought out and deeply considered. And this is something that we can inform. No young people.
Thank you so much for the talk, very interesting. So I had a question, you mentioned assigning value to ecosystem services. What would be, because there's a lot of argument that I've studied about this, that assigning monetary value to, say, the Amazon rainforest can actually have a negative effect as well. I'm just wondering what your stance is on this.
Right, so it's a very good question. The value of natural systems actually has been quantified. There's a wonderful paper that actually put a price on planet Earth and its functions. And the net result is that the cost is incalculable. It's so large that it's, if you had to make clean, fresh drinking water from water that you polluted, it's infinitely more expensive than nice thousands of years of percolation through aquifers. That said, you can identify certain ecosystem services that have real value, like bee pollination, or pick your favorite, whatever it is. And in almost every case, the cost of having to do that in some manual way or some human-supported way is it makes no sense. It's not economical. It's just you end up spending your time doing this thing that nature's doing for you for free. And this gets back to this whole question that nature does a lot for us for free. For example, just one thing is that the oceans take up 30% of every kilo of carbon dioxide we put in the atmosphere for free. And that's because the oceans are re-equilibrating with an atmosphere that's getting more and more carbon dioxide in it. The oceans have equilibrated with the pre-human atmosphere. And so the oceans are sucking up atmospheric CO2, and that's ocean acidification. That's 30% of carbon we're not seeing, that's not warming the Earth. If we had to pay for that, that'd be a lot. We didn't, a lot of us don't even know it's happening, but it's happening for free.
Talk. Hello. Hi.
Hello.
Recently, Mayor de Blasio proposed a major billion-dollar effort to shore up Lower Manhattan.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, this sort of thing will have to go on in other places like Miami and Newport News, et cetera, et cetera. Cumulatively, it's a very big price tag. What's the time frame for having to do these things?
Yeah, so I don't know the answer to that, but one of the most expensive things you can do is to keep nature out. Right after Hurricane Sandy, I participated in a city planning exercise at the Deutsche House near the UN, but it was like one of these, I think it was a week and a half after Sandy, and everyone was just freaking out, for lack of a better word, and just exploring all sorts of ideas. And one of the ideas that really stuck was this idea of basically turning Lower Manhattan into Venice. That is, welcome the sea. You move all the infrastructure up to the second and third floor, and you anticipate seasonal flooding and more flooding events. But rather than trying to, build out the sea or build a wall or build a barrier, which I don't know if any of you read the news last week about the levees in New Orleans, but they're sinking, which all of that area is sinking for man-made reasons, but it's sinking because that's sinking. The protection that this multi-billion-dollar project had been providing is going to be gone within a decade. So, these billions of dollars we've spent to rebuild the levees is is often, not often not, but is not going to give us the lifetime that we thought it would. So this idea of thinking we can kind of engineer ourselves out of the problem is really hard to accept. And the last thing is that, particularly with sea level rise, one of the really hard truths, but it's true, is that the rate of sea level rise is increasing, and it appears to be doing so exponentially, which is exactly what it does in the, when you look at the past. This is what it does. It doesn't just rise linearly, but as the Earth warms, what happens is the melting occurs exponentially faster, so the water that gets, or the melted ice that goes into the ocean increases exponentially, the sea level rise increases exponentially. And so the rate of sea level rise has tripled in just the last decade. And so, and that's going to triple, it's going to double again and double again, and that's going to keep on increasing. That's what it does historically with geologic records. So we don't expect it to be this linear relationship between sea level rise and warming. So to your point, should we be spending that kind of money? I don't know, I really know nothing about the actual engineering plan itself. I just think that it's, one has to be careful that we can geoengineer, or we can engineer ourselves out of these kind of problems without thinking more thoroughly about the time frame of how long they're going to be viable.
I think I have the microphone.
You do.
Thank you for everything that you're saying and sharing and the data and the arguments. I'm curious, you mentioned agriculture and the negative effect of warming. Is it possible to have some effect by changing farming techniques and soil capture? So I'm just curious about the potential of that.
Yep. So when I've given this talk in agricultural communities, one of the first responses, and I usually anticipate it, so I didn't do it for this group because I don't see too many farmers here. But one of the statements, which is very true, is that particularly in the United States, we've doubled and quintupled agricultural yields in our lifetimes. I mean, we are producing so much more food, and I put that in quotes, from a hectare of land than we ever have. And that's because of technology, in part Roundup and in part genetic engineering. But all those things together basically means we can grow genetically identical plants 2 centimeters apart from each other, and they will grow and produce a weight of food that's increasing over time. What I'm talking about are the checks in that growth. And you see them kind of like saw teeth that happen and when you get these warming events. So answering your question is, the impact on food is principally through food networks, because when you have these price shocks, as we mentioned, the wealthier nations can basically buy their way out of it, but as these price shocks crash, as these waves kind of crash on the developing world, they have really crippling effects on their economy.
Excuse me.
Yes?
But is it possible to capture carbon into the
So you're talking about biochar?
Yes, changing farming methods.
Right, so one of the ideas that some of you may know, I'm sorry, I didn't answer your question though. So one of the ideas with turning farming into a net carbon uptake practice is the idea of actually plowing the plant waste back into the soil, basically building up the organic carbon within the soil. And that's not done for time and efficiency reasons, but that's one way to store soil. Another one is through biochar, which is that you burn carbon and then actually bring it back into the soil again, and that carbon becomes inert in the soil and provides a way to bring more nutrients back into the soil. So these are all practices that I don't think are widespread and certainly not scalable to the kind of agriculture that we practice in this country. Thank you for clarifying that answer. Yes?
My friends and I are taking AP Environmental Science
Oh.
in school this year, and we felt so inspired after taking this class. And as the vice president of the Environmental Action Club, I've noticed from the student body at Greenwich High School, even though we have such great organizations around town, there's just an overall lack of inspiration and apathy, and there's apathy among students and teachers. And how do you suggest that we spread that drive to change too?
Yeah, so this has actually been one of the more, thank you for that question, it's a great question. This has been one of the more moving experiences I've had in my adult life, which was about a month ago, I got an email from somebody who I didn't know. And she wrote to me and said, can I meet in your office? I want to talk about, I hear you work in climate, I'd like to talk to you. And I get a lot of those. And this one I was like, I don't know. But something made me say yes. And I said, sure. It turned out to be Alexandra Villaseñor. Any of you know her? So there's a Washington Post article on this. You Google my name in Washington Post. And basically, I held the organizational meeting that started the national movement in the country that she's leading. So I have nothing to do with it. The last quote of the article says she was giving out assignments to her fellow students. And she's 13 years old. She's giving assignments to all of her, there's someone in California, there's someone in Miami, and she's giving all these assignments to these people. You're in charge of the protest here, you're in charge of the protest there. And he said, you, Peter, you're in charge of organizing the adults. And so I led this thing where we got not all, but the scientists who wanted to sign on to it basically signed a statement that showed our support for what she's trying to do, which is basically trying to say that the adults have sold out their future. And it's true. I'm sorry. I really am personally sorry that I'm part of this, but we have sold out your future, and you should be pissed. And you should know. So I understand the apathy, and the idea of the talk was really to kind of get you to see that it's not, the response to this isn't dread, it should be activation. And the next generation younger than you are doing it, or they're half a generation younger than you are doing it. And I'm just so impressed by their courage and their dedication, and they're just all in. They're totally all in. And they're the next voters, right? And so I feel optimistic because they're not going to forget their experience. And those of us who are 50 plus kind of know what it was like to protest nukes or protest whatever we were protesting back in those times. And we had something that we believed in. And I think your generation, this can and should be your thing. And to me, it would be, if I were in your shoes, I would be finding ways to join her band because she's great. And I can give you her email if you want.
Thank you again for your talk.
Thank you.
I earned a Columbia degree in environmental and occupational medicine. And the question that I have actually is two. One is, when I went to Beijing, I did have a tough time reading. And how many of us in this room should buy electric or hybrid vehicles to make a difference?
Right, so I think the question, so first of all, I am not going to fall into that trap of telling you what to do and what your diet should be. And, right, that is the worst thing to have some ivory tower professor tell you how you live your life. What I can say is that one of the best things you can do is to have a meatless Monday. If you're not a meat eater, you're just like, okay, one day a week I'm not going to eat meat from now on. Basically, that's one thing that one person can do. And for some people, they want to kill me when I say that. Other people say, well, I've been vegan for my whole life. Again, I don't want to get into that argument, but there are personal choices you can make. One of them can be installing solar. Another one thing you can go do this tomorrow is go to your electricity provider and say, I want my power to be sourced from renewable sources. You can do that. It's a box you can check. You can buy an electric vehicle. You can buy an electric vehicle and put solar panels on your house, and it will pay for itself in half a decade. Ties up a few tens of thousands of dollars, but then it's done. And you end up making money in the end. It's such a much more sound investment. So, I don't want to tell anyone how to live their lives. That's not what this is about. It's more just be aware that this change is inevitable. Because in my opinion, the genie's out of the bottle. The economic genie is out of the bottle. And so the more we pretend like we're living in the buggy whip time, the more we're not embracing this future. That's really beautiful. And I think it's something that we can do as wealthier Americans is lead by example.
You mentioned that some countries like United Kingdom were
It's a
very...
mighty voice. Oh, there you go, sorry.
You mentioned that some countries like United Kingdom were very successful in reducing the footprint. So I was wondering whether there is any mechanism to facilitate the learning curves for the countries who are not as successful in order to accomplish the target. Another related question, I know that a while ago there was a lot of interest in using wave energy and tides in order to obtain this clean energy. You didn't mention it in your presentation. Are any efforts in that regard?
Yeah. So the UK story is so impressive in part because they were such outrageous polluters back in the 1800s. You know, it was just this incredible profligate burning of coal. But you know, they are one of the leading nations in terms of action on climate. So is Denmark, so is Sweden, so is Germany, with a caveat. You know, like an example is this country. You know, why aren't we doing this in this country? It makes economic sense. It makes jobs. It's all these things. You know, the Green New Deal, and it's because we're polarized as a people. And I think if ever there was a unifying theme to this, it's not so much to embrace the green aspect of it, but it's like this is what makes sense for us. You know, for national security. There's a whole other talk I could give on national security. So I think. It's not, the learning curve is the baseline for everybody. That learning rate is basically, that's the price available to anyone who could purchase these things. That's the price of your iPhone, that's the price of your computer. So that's available to the general population. Whether we choose to adopt it is a personal or a political decision. And that is where we're stagnating in this country. That discussion is frozen. And part of my reason for being here is to unfreeze it. And I'm sorry, your second question was on wave energy. So on wave energy, the problem with that is that there are relatively few places that have such large tides, and the transmission from wave energy or from wave or tidal energy to electricity is inefficient compared to solar panels. It's just that we're not very far along that learning curve, so it's still expensive. And just for, I'm just going to just say something to the crowd or the group generally. Is that no one's mentioned nuclear yet.
That was my question.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So one, I'll just riff on nuclear, which is that, so when you make a plot of all the technologies, everything, versus, you know, showing that learning rate, which is basically cost per deployment, solar, wind, petroleum products, all have this negative slope, meaning they get cheaper and more widely deployed. The only technology that not only doesn't have a negative slope, but has a positive slope is nuclear. And the reason is because the stuff is poisonous. And it's really super toxic, and we don't know where to put the waste. And that cost of protecting civilians from Chernobyl is high. And society has to come to grips with this balance between we want clean, cheap energy, and we don't want risk. And so, if a technology emerges like breeder reactors or thorium reactors, which is another story, fascinating story unto itself, I'm totally open for that. I'm not against nuclear per se, it's just that I wouldn't want to live next to one.
So, should I go ahead? It was actually a two-part question, but one of them was on nuclear, and the second one was, I've read that something like 14 or 15% of greenhouse gases come from the transportation sector.
Mm-hmm.
And I first came across it in this movie, Cowspiracy, which I think is quite good, but it said, well, it's 18% of it is animal agriculture, and then someone else said, well, if you don't have the cows breeding and things like that, it's actually more like 51%, and you didn't focus on it in your presentation here, but is that something that first 18 to 51%, do you find those numbers accurate, and do you think it's solvable with technology such as growing meat in a lab?
Not for me. So meat is incredibly intensive in terms of carbon emissions. It's not only this is what we're talking about, meat, right? Okay. So meat is many times more wasteful in terms of carbon emissions than a plant-based diet. And it has the waste, or the emissions debt, or the emissions requirement to produce a pound of meat, not only goes into the cows and that, but it goes into the land use, it goes into the transportation, it goes into the processing. The main thing is waste. Is that we waste so much food in this country. We waste a ton, we waste
40%.
billions of tons of food. And part of it is, that's who we are as a country, sad, but it's true. South Korea, does anyone know what South Korea does? South Korea has I think 85% of their organic waste is put into digesters, and their liquid organic waste is trucked away. And so they're scooping their food into bags, and these organic bags that have been picked up. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting off your topic. So meat is delicious, but it's it's a hard. The biggest challenge that the Earth faces right now is that as the rest of the world starts becoming wealthier, they're going to want a meat-based diet. And then we start looking at the emissions signature of that, it's frightening.
And then just to follow up on nuclear, you said about it being dangerous, but I thought coal would kill like 9 million people a year for air pollution and things like Chernobyl.
Yes, you're right.
Almost zero, I mean, it's like almost nobody dies.
Well,
Or at least it's like 1,000 to 1, isn't it?
So yeah, so you're right. So coal is much more sort of pernicious in that way. In that, but we separate asthma deaths from the fact that very few or an insufficient number of lawsuits are tied to coal producers, because we accept that as a risk, and that in this country we don't value the lives of people to whom we put power plants next to. But that's sad but true. We don't socialize those costs. We just let it happen. So you're right. You're right. I think coal is much more. Certainly, the integrated number of deaths is much higher with coal, and there's been very few deaths linked to nuclear. The problem is that we've got this big reservoir of poison that we don't know where to put. And to me, that would be that is the sticking point for me. Is that just knowing that there's a problem that we have to solve, and this is going to get worse the more you adopt it. I'm sorry, you've got a question?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm with the League of Women Voters, and I'm dying to ask you, what role are your professional colleagues in the academic and scientific world doing to educate legislators in Washington about everything you said tonight, to keep the pressure on to make change?
So what's interesting is that, as a scientist, I used to go to the Hill. I used to be invited to give talks to the staffers, and there was a good 10-year chunk of my career where they were welcoming us to come down there, and that is no longer true. That is no longer, they don't want to hear from us. And this war on science is very real. So those of you who reveled in watching the Apollo landing or any technological achievement, that capacity for America is diminishing. I mean, climate is just one side of it, but this is a broader investment in the sciences. And the role of science in the larger community has really changed just in the last, certainly in the last decade, but just in the last 2 years. So, the question then is, how can we influence, or how can we have an influence in the political process? The one thing that really doesn't work, as much as I agree with the general intent of Al Gore's movie, it was that movie. That is not the way to get people to change, is by scaring them. I think, I'm hoping that this kind of a message is more of an empowering one that then allows people to see that it makes economic sense to do this, that there are ways to basically be better to the planet, be better to yourself, be better to your neighbors, and be more sustainable. That actually is more economic as well.
And we have time for 2 more questions.
Okay.
So here and then one over there, and unfortunately.
I want to thank Sandy here in front, my gardener. She helped me plant a pollinator garden this afternoon, so there you go first. So I wanted to ask, I read recently, I think it was in The Uninhabitable Earth, that the increased wildfires in California negated much, if not all, of their recent gains in energy efficiency and carbon reduction. So I wonder if between increasing wildfires and melting permafrost, you have any concern that we're just going to be on a hamster wheel trying to break even at best?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, what happens after fires, of course, is that the land, the soil, the vegetation grows back and re-sequesters the carbon that it gave off. So, as long as the place that burned doesn't just become a desert, you get all that carbon back into the soil within years. So that is not I'm less concerned about that. What we don't know about the permafrost situation, that we do know permafrost is melting. We don't know if it's going to be this, a methane gun, what they're calling it, basically sudden release of greenhouse gases. That's been hypothesized. I was actually on CBS News talking about this a couple of weeks ago. I don't think, my more immediate concern is that if we adopt the stance that there's nothing we can do, we just kind of have to adapt, the world that we inherit and the world that we pass on to our children is the worst possible hamster wheel you could convey to any living person. And it's obviously not just about people, it's about entire ecosystems. And so, I just think it's not just our own livelihoods that's at stake, it's everything that we love about the planet. And that, the planet doesn't really care about us one way or the other. Things are going to change regardless. But we enjoyed, I don't want to go there, but I think it's very important to not give up hope and to focus on what we can do to solve the problem, rather than just saying, there's so many things that can go wrong, why even try? And I think, the despair that the students were talking about, I think that's where some of this comes from. You have to see a foothold. And I think if you're willing to take that first foothold, if you do it all together, I think that's how we sort of embrace change. And any of you who have European friends, French, German, Norwegian, whatever, testify, right? The lives that they're living are fantastic. They have excellent quality of health, they have excellent, they're living perfectly actualized, realized lives, but they have a different value system than we have presently in this country. And they made that transition at some point in their lives, and we can do that too. And the outcome is not throwing us back to the Stone Age, it's actually a better life.
Hi. By the way, I loved your presentation. It was really good. But I have 2 questions. So the first one, a lot of the time, I'm a huge believer in climate change and everything, and I try to preach it and teach it to a lot of people that I know. But a lot of the arguments that I kind of get back from some people, including my science teacher actually, is a lot of the time, they believe that climate change is happening, but they think that it's kind of a natural cycle that happens every few thousands of years. And usually I don't have a lot of time to explain to them how that's not true. So do you know if there's a quick kind of way you can kind of tell them that that's not true, while just in a few quick sentences, just so that they can really get the message while not having all of the data and all the information available. And so my second question is also, you were talking about how with nuclear energy, there's a lot of waste that's poisonous and people don't really know what to do with it. And I'm pretty sure that probably comes from the uranium that they use or something like that. And so I was wondering if they're trying to find ways, or if people are starting to like research ways that you can kind of try and like recycle that, or if that's not possible.
Yeah, great questions, great questions. So on the latter point, there are some nuclear waste reprocessing technologies that exist. They're expensive and challenging, and I don't know that they're that scalable. But most of all, I don't really know that the technological side of that to that degree. Other than I know that there are options we could have made, or decisions we could have made early on, whether to pursue thorium-based reactors or uranium-based reactors. Oppenheimer pushed us to the uranium side, and so we own that fission rather than a fusion approach. But the, so my oldest brother is like your teacher. Family events are tough. And the problem is that, and the question I would ask many of you who have these kinds of situations is to ask them how they know what they think they know. And a lot of times you find out it's skin deep. And that's why I did what I did tonight, was that for those of you who are interested in understanding why we know what we know, that it's not just me saying, I could have just shown you the temperature rise and said, look, that's all due to CO2, and you probably want to nod your heads. And those of you who believe would believe, and those of you who are skeptical would be like, you didn't do anything other than tell me, show me a figure I've already seen. And so part of it is kind of knowing that this is actually a hard truth of the problem, is that there is no alternative hypothesis for why the Earth is warming. You can ask any person who knows, who positions themselves on the sort of anti-global warming platform, and you ask them, you take them to the mat and say, what do you really know about this problem? And then they'll say, oh, you guys are lying, you guys are making data. That's not answering the question. That's just saying, you're not attacking you're not addressing my question. You're saying that I'm lying. And I'm saying I'm not. That can go on forever, right? When you say, so what is it? What is the mechanism? They say, oh, it's the ice ages. How do you know that? Because I read it on a blog. And usually they're not, they won't say that. They'll say, I've been reading about it, and I hear there are geologic cycles all the time. You can tell the drilling story I just told you. So, a way to get into it is just to probe a little bit deeper about where they're coming from. And I think this is a good place to close, actually, which is that some of you may know Katharine Hayhoe, who's a climate scientist at Texas Tech University, which is the second most conservative district in the United States. And aside from being personally threatened with death threats and the rest of it, she is evangelical, both in her religion but also in her approach toward getting this message out. And the single best advice that she has is to reach across the aisle. That is, meet people at their values. Don't be an ivory tower professor telling you how to live. That is to meet people where they are and understand where they are coming from, what's motivating them to be so defensive on this. And sometimes it's just because they don't like the question, do you believe in climate change? Well, it's not really a religion, right? It's actually, do you believe in gravity? It's not that, it's physical evidence. And so I think part of it is to educate yourself on the basic facts, which you have done. And then the other thing is to sort of find out where they're coming from. That's making them ask those, make them take that position. A lot of times it's because they don't want to be told how to live their lives. And you say, look, I'm not telling you how to live your life. I just want to know what you think the counter-argument is. And if you scratch a little bit, you find out it's not very deep. And it can't be deep because there is nothing there.
I'd like to thank Professor Domenico for a wonderful presentation, and I'd also like to thank all of you for your wonderful Q&A. It was a really engaging discussion. Thank you. A couple of messages on behalf of the League of Women Voters. Please check out our website. We have a really, really great slate of engaging conversations and events coming up, and we'd like you to join us if you can. If you're not a member, you can join or find out more about joining either online or at the front with our membership desk. We'd also like you to do the same with our partners. they all would like you to participate and sign up with their lists as well, as we would. And also for students here, and we're really happy to see you, if you'd like to join us, we have a student membership which is free, free. So we'd like you to contact our membership, our youth membership coordinator, which is Anne-Marie, who was handing around the microphone over there on my left. So thank you again. This was